Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I worked one summer on a corn farm in western Iowa, just outside of Carroll. It was one of those jobs that sounded simple at first. Early mornings, long days, hard work. But you learn quickly that farms have their own kind of silence. It's not peaceful, it's heavy. Like the air itself remembers everything that's ever happened there. I was 19 that summer, same age as the farmer's son, Ethan. His father, Mr. Klein, ran about 400 acres of corn and soybeans, and I was hired mostly to help with harvest prep, hauling feed, fixing fences, greasing machinery, that sort of thing. The farm had 3 big silos lined up beside the main barn, each one tall enough to make your neck ache when you looked up at them. From a distance, they looked quiet and clean, but inside they were dusty, loud, and choking. The smell of corn dust sticks in your nose, and after a few hours your throat starts to burn from breathing it in. I never liked going near the augers, those long metal spirals that pull the grain up from the trucks into the silo. They made this constant low hum when they were running, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground. That day started hot and dull. No wind, just the kind of sticky air that makes the sweat on your skin feel like glue. Ethan was checking the silos while I was helping load feed bags onto a flatbed. He'd been told to clean out the south silo's base because the auger was clogging again. That happened a lot when the corn was damp or if some stalk fragments got mixed in. Normally, you're supposed to shut everything down, wear a harness, and have someone else outside watching, in case something goes wrong. But on a farm, shortcuts are just part of the routine. Nobody thinks twice about it until something happens. Ethan said he'd just get it done quick. I saw him head toward the silo around 11, wiping sweat from his forehead with his shirt sleeve. He didn't take a harness. I remember thinking he looked tired. His shirt soaked through, jeans caked with dust, boots dragging a little. I didn't think much of it. None of us did. The morning moved slow. The air was full of that dry smell of corn and diesel and metal grease. After about an hour, Mr. Klein came out from the machine shed and asked where Ethan was. Someone said he was still at the silo. He frowned and looked toward it. The fans were off and the auger was silent. That's when it started to feel strange. The silence from that side of the yard didn't sound right. Normally, you could hear the echo of the auger even from across the barnyard, a faint, steady rattle. But now there was nothing, just the steady chirp of grasshoppers and the distant buzz of power lines. Mr. Klein walked over first. I followed with another worker, a guy named Carl. When we got closer, I noticed the ground near the silo's base looked disturbed, like someone had been moving around quickly. There was a small pile of corn dust and footprints leading toward the hatch. The hatch door was half open. The air smelled thick and stale, that kind of heavy odor that builds up inside enclosed grain. Mr. Klein shouted his son's name once, but the sound died right there. He climbed up the ladder and looked in, then went still. After a few seconds, he climbed down and opened the control box beside the auger. The switch was in the on position. Nobody had touched it. Nobody had turned it on. It was just running. We all knew what that meant before anyone said a word. Inside a silo, once the auger restarts and the grain starts moving again, it acts like quicksand. You can't climb out, you can't grab anything, you just sink. The air inside fills with dust so thick you can't breathe. We shut everything down and started digging. We used shovels at first, then a grain vacuum when we realized how deep it was. It felt endless. The corn was warm from the sun and from the machinery, and it gave off this dry, suffocating heat that made the inside of the silo unbearable. The air was so full of dust it felt like breathing sand. Every few minutes we'd stop to catch our breath, hands shaking, hearts pounding, listening to the sound of metal scraping metal. After about an hour, the corn level had dropped enough that we could see where it had crusted over near the auger's intake. Someone had jammed a wooden pole down into it, probably Ethan trying to break the clog. The pole was bent, snapped halfway down, buried in the corn. We kept digging. The silence was worse than any sound. Just the echo of our breathing, the rasp of shovels and the hollow clang when a shovel hit the side of the metal wall. It took nearly 2 hours before we found him. The auger had pulled him down and buried him beneath tons of grain. When they uncovered him, nobody said anything. We just stopped. The smell of corn dust hung in the air, mixed with sweat and the faint metallic tang of machinery. The whole place went still. Even the insects outside had gone quiet. They called the sheriff, and soon there were trucks parked all along the driveway, lights flashing in the haze. The paramedics climbed up and down the ladder, but everyone already knew there was nothing to be done. The coroner came later that afternoon. They carried him out covered in a tarp, the dust sticking to everything like ash. I remember how his father just stood there, hands on his knees, breathing like he'd run a mile. The rest of us were told to take the rest of the day off. I walked down the gravel road that evening, just trying to clear my head. The air was heavy and dry, and every breath carried that same smell of corn dust. I could still feel it in my throat. The sound of the auger wouldn't leave my ears. That slow rattle, the rhythm of it, it kept replaying in my head. The next morning I came back early before sunrise. The sky was a pale gray, and everything was still wet with dew. I figured maybe they'd shut down the silos for a while, but when I got there, the auger was already running again. Mr. Klein was standing by the barn, staring at it. He didn't say anything, just walked past me like he didn't see me. The sound of the auger filled the air again, steady and cold. It made the whole ground hum. I went back to work, but I couldn't stop glancing at that silo. Every time the auger rattled, it felt like the sound was alive, like it didn't care what had happened. The grain moved through the pipes like it always did, fast and mechanical, as if nothing was different. But the silence between the noise, that was worse. When the auger would stop for a few seconds, the quiet that followed felt wrong, like something missing that should still be there. I worked the rest of the summer, but I avoided that side of the farm as much as I could. The smell never went away. That mixture of corn dust and metal and something faintly sour lingered every time the air shifted. Even now, years later, I can still smell it if I think hard enough. Sometimes I'll be driving through open farmland and see silos lined up along the horizon, and I'll remember how quiet that day was when we realized Ethan was gone. I'll remember the shovels hitting metal, the sound echoing up through that hollow cylinder, and the way the corn gave under our boots as we dug. I'll remember the faint, steady rattle of the auger starting up again, like it had no memory at all of what it had done. Machines don't remember. Farms don't stop. Everything keeps moving because it has to. But that summer, I learned how fast something can happen. How one small mistake can get buried so deep it becomes part of the place itself. Every sound, every smell, every quiet moment after. It stays with you, and every time I think back to that farm, I can still hear it. That faint, constant hum from the silo, the rattle of grain against metal. Like it never stopped. Like it's still running somewhere out there, under that same heavy Iowa sky. My uncle's farm sat about 20 miles east of Amarillo, out where the land started flattening into that dry, endless plain. It wasn't a big operation. Mostly corn, a few cows, and a small number of hogs he raised and butchered himself. The hog barn stood a little apart from the main buildings, close to the windbreak line, its corrugated tin roof always creaking whenever the wind came in from the west. I used to help him there when I was younger, scraping the troughs, hauling feed, trying not to gag from the smell. The barn had a heavy, sour odor that stuck to your clothes even after washing. He had a side section where he did his butchering. Nothing fancy, just a concrete floor with a drain in the center, a couple of hanging hooks and an old deep freeze humming against the wall. There was always some trace of what went on in there. The air felt sticky. The corners never seemed to dry completely, no matter how often he hosed them out. I remember flies gathering thick in summer, a low, steady hum under the single hanging bulb. It happened in early June, maybe 12 years ago. The days were long and hot, the kind where the air feels like dust and every metal surface burns your skin if you touch it. The hogs got restless in that kind of heat, especially the sows. My uncle had one big sow then, close to 500 pounds. Mean thing. She'd charge the gate if you got too close with the bucket. He'd warned everyone to stay clear of her pen unless he was there. He had a farmhand working for him at the time, a young guy named Rustle. About mid-20s, worked hard during the day but had a drinking problem. My uncle used to complain that he'd show up hungover or disappear on weekends without saying a word. But he was strong and didn't mind getting filthy, so my uncle kept him around longer than he should have. That night, around 3 in the morning, my aunt woke up to what she said sounded like screaming. Not an animal sound, something worse. My uncle got up thinking maybe one of the hogs had gotten tangled or something had broken loose. He took his flashlight and went out across the yard, still half asleep, the beam bouncing ahead of him through the dark. The barn was silent when he got there, except for the fan in the corner that never quite drowned out the creaks of the building. The air was thick with that sour pig smell, but heavier than usual, almost metallic. He pushed the door open and saw the gate to the sow pen half torn from its hinges. The sow was loose somewhere inside, grunting deep and rough, moving fast enough that he could hear her hooves scraping on the concrete. He swung the light toward the far end, and that's when he saw a shape on the floor. At first, he thought it was one of the hogs that had been attacked, but as he got closer, he realized it was Rustle. He was sprawled out, his shirt ripped halfway off, one arm twisted underneath him. His legs were covered in blood. My uncle said the sow was just standing there beside him, panting, her snout dark red, eyes wild. He didn't even think. He ran back outside, grabbed his rifle from the truck, and came back in. The sow charged at him the moment he stepped inside. He said her hooves slammed against the floor so hard the whole barn shook. He fired twice before she dropped, sliding forward on the blood-slick concrete. When the echo died, all he could hear was Rustle wheezing, this wet, broken sound. They called for help after that. The ambulance took almost half an hour to reach the farm, and by then my uncle had wrapped Russell's legs in old feed sacks to slow the bleeding. He survived, but they said he lost most of the muscle in one leg and never walked right again. Nobody really knew why he'd come back that night. Later, they found one of the deep freezers open, meat missing. Looked like he'd come drunk, trying to steal some, and maybe dropped something that spooked the sow when he passed her pen. She must have busted out after him. The next day, I went over there to help my uncle clean up. The whole barn was quiet, like it had just emptied itself of sound. The sow still lay there under a tarp, her body stiff, a dark pool underneath. The smell was thick, sweet, and rotten. The floor where Rustle had been was slick with dried blood, so much that it had seeped into the cracks of the concrete. My uncle tried scrubbing it with bleach, but it didn't make a difference. The boards around the pen had deep gouges where the sow had slammed herself against them. He stood there for a long time with his hands on his hips, staring at the mess. His face looked hollow, like he'd aged 10 years overnight. After that day, he never used that barn again. He moved the rest of the hogs to the smaller shed near the road and locked up the big one. He even took down the electric line that powered the lights inside. Said he didn't want to hear that hum anymore. Months later, the stains were still there. You could smell it every time the wind shifted right. The wood soaked it up, the blood, the rot, everything. Nobody would go in there. Even the stray cats avoided that place. In the evenings, when the sun hit the tin roof, the barn always looked darker than it should have, like the light slid right off it. One time that fall, I went to help my uncle harvest corn. We finished late and ended up near that barn after sunset. The air was cool, quiet, and still. You could hear crickets and the low buzz of a generator from the main house. I walked close enough to the barn to see inside through a crack in the door. The air coming out was warm and smelled like something old, like spoiled feed and rust. I could still see the outlines of the stains on the floor, dark and uneven. The next year, he had a crew come put a padlock on the door and board up the windows. Said he'd tear it down someday, but he never did. It just sat there year after year, the roof sagging a little more, the weeds creeping up around the foundation. When he passed a few years back, I helped clean out the property. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, except that barn. The boards were gray and dry, the nails rusted through. But when I pried open one of the side doors, The smell came out like it had been waiting. It was the same smell from that morning, thick, coppery, rotten. The bloodstains were still there, faint but clear if you knew where to look. The concrete was rough and pitted, the drain clogged with dirt. There were still faint marks on the gate, scratches deep enough to catch your fingernail on. I stood there a long time, trying to picture how it must have happened. Russell stumbling in drunk, flashlight shaking in his hand, the sow grunting from her pen. Maybe he didn't even see her move until she hit him. It didn't take much. A hog that size can crush bone like it's nothing. I remember thinking how quick it all must have been, how sudden. I shut the door when I left. The hinges groaned and the sound echoed across the field. The padlock was still there, orange with rust hanging useless. I walked back to the house and looked once more at the barn from the porch. It looked the same as it always had. Quiet, gray, slumped against the horizon. A few months later, the new owners tore it down. My aunt said she was relieved. Said she didn't want to see it anymore. When I drove past that spot last summer, there was just open grass where it used to stand. Nothing left but a square patch of dirt that looked darker than the rest of the field. Like the ground itself had held onto something it couldn't forget. That barn was gone. But I still remember how it smelled. How it felt standing inside that night. Some things don't leave you. They just sit quiet somewhere in your head. Like that barn did on the edge of the windbreak, waiting for you to think about them again. When I bought the old farm outside Helena in the summer of 2004, I wasn't looking for anything special. The listing said, foreclosed property needs work, and that was fine by me. I'd been living in town for years, working a job that never really went anywhere. I wanted space, quiet, and a project to keep my hands busy. The land stretched out for about 40 acres, good soil, half overgrown, with a weathered barn and a 2-story farmhouse that leaned a little to the west. The bank agent said the previous owners had left around the late 90s. No one knew much about them. Just another family that fell behind on payments and vanished into town life, I guessed. The house was bad, but fixable. Roof leaked, wallpaper peeling in strips, animal nests in the attic. The barn had a smell that never quite left. Old hay, dust, maybe something dead long ago. But the land itself was alive. Thick grass underfoot, a creek cutting through the back edge of the property, and sunlight that felt different out there. I decided I'd fix it up piece by piece. I started with the brush around the barn. It had grown wild, waist-high, with thorns and nettles that made it impossible to walk through. Every morning after coffee, I'd take my gloves, machete, and a rusted wheelbarrow and just start cutting. It was hard work, but satisfying. Each day I'd clear another few feet. Sometimes I'd find junk, old cans, bits of wire, once even a rusted child's tricycle half buried. It made me wonder how long it had all been sitting there, untouched. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into clearing, I found the well. It was behind the barn, almost swallowed up by the weeds. At first I thought it was just a patch of collapsed ground, but when I kicked the dirt away, I saw the edge of a circular stone wall. About 3 feet wide, capped with a thick piece of plywood and some old boards nailed across the top. There was an iron handle stuck in one corner, so I figured someone had used it to lift the cover off before. I wasn't planning to use it. I had running water from the main line, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see how deep it was, if maybe it could be restored someday. Wells have history. People draw from them for generations. I liked the thought of reconnecting to that. The cap was heavier than I expected. When I pried it up, a rush of cold air came out, damp still with that smell of dirt that hasn't been touched in years. I leaned over and looked down, but it was too dark to see anything. No glimmer of water, just black. I fetched my flashlight from the barn and pointed it in. The beam reached maybe 15 feet down before the walls started narrowing slightly. Still no sign of water. I was about to pull back when I noticed something at the bottom. A pale, uneven layer that caught the light. At first I thought it was stone. Then I realized they were bones. I froze there staring. Dozens of small white shapes piled together, tangled in each other. Legs, ribs, skulls. Some tiny, some larger, all stripped clean. I remember the feeling that ran through me then. Not quite fear, not yet, but a cold kind of unease. The kind that settles in your stomach before your mind catches up. I told myself they were animal remains. Probably farm animals. Maybe someone dumped them there after a bad winter or a disease outbreak. That kind of thing happened. Still, I wanted to know for sure. I found a long stick near the barn, tied a wrench to the end with wire and lowered it down. It hit solidly after about 20 feet. I could see now that the bones weren't just thrown in. They were arranged, neatly stacked, layer by layer, like someone had been placing them carefully over time. I didn't like that thought. I pulled the stick out and backed away. The afternoon light had turned orange by then, the kind of light that makes every shadow feel longer. I put the cap back over the well, but the fit wasn't tight anymore. The air coming from underneath had that faint smell of rot, even though the bones looked clean. I couldn't shake it. That night I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed listening to the wind scrape the branches against the siding. Every sound felt louder. The image of those bones kept coming back. The way they were laid out, the care someone had taken. I tried to reason through it. Maybe they were old hunting trophies. Maybe a former owner had used the well to dispose of small carcasses. But none of it fit. Why so organized? Why there of all places? The next morning I decided I couldn't just leave it like that. I went into town and bought gravel and concrete mix. My plan was simple: fill it, seal it, forget about it. I didn't want to dig around or call anyone. It wasn't a crime scene, not anymore. Probably decades old. I just didn't want it open on my land. When I came back that afternoon, I pried the cap off again. The smell was worse. Maybe it was the heat. I didn't look too long this time. I shoveled the gravel in, one load at a time, listening to it clatter against the stone walls. It took hours. The sound changed as the hole filled. At first hollow, then dull, then finally solid. When I reached the top, I poured a thin layer of concrete, smoothed it flat, and left it to set. I remember standing there afterward, hands on my knees, breathing hard. The sun was low behind the barn, and for a moment everything felt still. No birds, no insects, just that heavy, unmoving quiet. I told myself it was done. The past was buried, literally. But over the next few weeks, something about that spot kept drawing my attention. Whenever I walked past the barn, I'd glance toward it without meaning to. Just a round patch of fresh concrete, pale against the dirt. Nothing strange about it. Still, it felt like a scar on the land. A reminder of something I didn't understand. I started thinking about the people who'd lived there before me. I looked through old county records, just curiosity at first. The property had changed hands a few times in the 70s and 80s, mostly small farmers who defaulted or moved away. One name came up twice, a man who'd run a dog breeding operation there for a few years. The note beside it said, "License revoked 1988. That made my skin crawl a little. I didn't need to read further. I could guess what that meant. After that, I stopped wondering. I worked the fields, fixed the fences, patched the roof. Life went on. By fall, the barn smelled like hay again, and the grass grew evenly. I almost convinced myself the well had never been there at all. Every once in a while, though, I'd be out early, before sunrise, when the light was gray and the air sharp. I'd stand by the barn with my coffee, and I'd think about the weight of all that gravel pressing down on those bones. How whoever put them there must have stood in the same spot decades before, lowering each one by hand, making sure they fit just right. That kind of patience meant something. Not madness, not chaos, but purpose. I didn't know what that purpose was, and I never wanted to find out, so I left it alone. I let grass grow over the patch, let time do what it does. By the next spring, you couldn't even tell where the well had been. Just level ground, green and quiet. But even now, when I think back on it, the image comes clear as the day I found it. The pale light from the flashlight, the neat layers of bones in that strange, careful order beneath the dirt. I've dug a lot of holes in my life, planted trees, laid fence posts, turned soil. Nothing ever felt like that well. It wasn't what was in it that unsettled me. It was the certainty that someone had stood there, maybe years before I was even born, and built that thing bone by bone, knowing exactly what they were doing. And that thought, more than anything I saw, was what stayed with me. I grew up on a dairy farm in central Wisconsin, a quiet place surrounded by endless fields and patches of woods. The land had been in my family for 3 generations. My father ran it his whole life, from before dawn until late into the night, every single day. We had around 50 cows, mostly Holsteins, and a few old jerseys he refused to sell because he said they reminded him of his father's herd. The farm wasn't big by modern standards, but it was steady. Our days were built around routines. Milking at 5 in the morning, feeding after, checking fences, cleaning stalls, and then doing it all again in the evening. Life was simple, predictable, until that night. It was early summer, one of those heavy, humid nights when the air feels like it's holding its breath. A thunderstorm rolled in after sunset, sudden and violent. I remember watching it from the kitchen window, the whole horizon flashing white every few seconds. The power went out not long after the first crack of lightning hit nearby. Everything went black, and the only sounds were the wind howling through the trees and the rain hitting the metal roof of the barn like gravel. Dad grabbed a flashlight and said he was going to check the generator. He always did that himself, never trusted me with anything electrical. I was 16 at the time. He told me to stay inside, but I knew the routine. When the power went out, it meant the electric fence around the pasture went down too. Without that current, the cows sometimes wandered. Normally, he'd check both the generator and the fence before the night was over. The storm lasted for hours. Thunder rolled across the fields like the sky was splitting apart. The wind bent the trees so low I thought they'd snap. When it finally eased off, sometime after midnight, everything went eerily still. No frogs, no crickets, just the faint dripping of rain off the barn roof. I went to my room and tried to sleep, figuring Dad had handled it like always. When I woke up, the sun was already up, pale and weak through a gray sky. I noticed right away that Dad wasn't in the house. His boots were gone, but his jacket was still hanging by the door. That wasn't normal. He always came in for coffee before starting chores. The cows were still in the pasture, huddled near the gate, silent and still, which was strange. Usually they'd be restless, ready for milking. I slipped on my boots and went out, the air cool and damp, the ground soft from all the rain. The smell of wet earth mixed with manure hung in the air. I walked down toward the barn, calling for him out of habit, but my voice just echoed back from the trees. As I got closer to the pasture fence, I saw something that didn't look right. The cows were all clustered in one spot, near the far side by the generator shed. They weren't moving, just standing there shoulder to shoulder, staring at the ground. I thought maybe a tree had fallen or something spooked them, so I went that way. My boots sank in the mud, each step heavier than the last. The ground near the generator was torn up, full of boot prints and fresh puddles. That's when I saw him. He was lying face down in the mud right next to the fence line. His hands were still gripping a wire, and the metal had burned into his palm. His body was stiff, like he'd been there for hours. The flashlight he'd taken was half buried in the muck, still faintly glowing. His cap was lying a few feet away, soaked through. At first I didn't understand what I was looking at. My brain refused to make sense of it. He looked almost asleep, except for the way his arm was twisted under him. When I touched his back, he was cold and hard. I froze, just standing there in silence. The cows didn't move. They stayed in their half circle around him, staring, not making a sound. Normally they would have scattered when I walked up. Instead, it was like they were waiting for me to do something. Later, the sheriff said it looked like he'd tried to reconnect a wire to the generator without cutting the main power first. He must have thought the line was dead. When the current came through, it hit him instantly. The ground was soaked, which only made it worse. They said he wouldn't have felt anything. It would have been over in a second. But standing there, looking down at him in the mud, I couldn't imagine it being that simple. I remember kneeling next to him for a long time, not knowing what to do. My hands shook when I tried to roll him over, but I couldn't. I just sat there while the sky slowly lightened. The smell of wet grass and manure heavy in the air. The cows stayed silent. A few flies had already started to gather around his clothes. I tried to push them away, but they came back again and again. I couldn't hear anything else. No wind, no birds, just the faint buzzing of insects and the slow drip of water off the eaves of the shed. When I finally stood up, I saw the wire still stretched across the mud. It was blackened at the end where it had sparked. The post near it had a burn mark too, a thin black line running down the wood. The rain must have carried the smell away overnight, but I could still feel it. That sharp metallic tang of something burnt. The rest of that day felt like a blur. I called the neighbor from the old rotary phone in the kitchen, voice shaking so bad I could barely talk. The sheriff came, then the coroner, then a couple of men from the power company. They asked me questions I could hardly answer. Every time they mentioned accident, it made my stomach twist. I couldn't stand hearing that word. It sounded too clean for what I saw. They took his body away in a black van, and I just stood in the yard covered in mud, watching them drive off down the gravel road. The cows had finally started to move again, slowly drifting back toward the barn. I went through the motions of feeding them, though I don't remember doing it. The smell of silage and manure felt heavier than usual, like the air itself didn't want to move. That night, I sat on the porch until it got dark again. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of wet hay and the faint hum of insects. The generator was fixed, the power back on, lights glowing in the barn windows. Everything looked normal from a distance, but nothing felt the same. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow heavier. Over the next weeks, I tried to keep the farm going. Neighbors helped at first, bringing food, lending tools, checking on me. But after a while, people stopped coming. They had their own farms, their own lives. I got up before sunrise, milked the cows, cleaned the stalls, fixed the fence where the post was burned. I did everything he used to do, but the place felt hollow. Every time I walked past that spot by the generator, I felt my chest tighten. I started avoiding it, taking longer routes just to stay away. The cows never went near that side of the pasture again. I noticed that after a few weeks. Even when I opened the gate wide, they'd graze everywhere else but stop short before that patch of ground. I don't know if animals remember things like that, but it felt like they did. They'd stand at a distance, quiet and alert, like they were waiting for something to happen. I lasted another year on that farm. I told myself I could handle it, that it was what he would have wanted. But every time a storm rolled in, I couldn't breathe right. I'd lie awake and listen to the wind, half expecting to hear him out there again, boots squelching through the mud. When the thunder started, I'd unplug everything, shut off the lights, and just wait for it to pass. Eventually, I put the place up for sale. The day I left, I walked down to the pasture one last time. The grass had grown back over the muddy spot, but I could still see where the post was blackened. The cows were grazing near the fence, calm and slow, the way they used to before all of it. I stood there a long time watching them, remembering that morning and the stillness, the silence, the way they had gathered around him like they understood something I didn't. I sold the herd to a neighbor and left the rest behind. I never went back. Sometimes when I drive through that part of Wisconsin, I still see farms that look like ours. Red barns, white fences, the same rolling fields, but I never stop. I just keep driving, because no matter how much time passes, that image never leaves me. Him lying face down in the mud, the cows standing still, the quiet stretching on forever. It's the kind of thing that settles deep inside you, the kind of silence that never really goes away. It was the summer of 2011 in central Kansas, dry and hot enough that the dirt roads turned to dust with every pickup that rolled past. I was 22, working as a farmhand on a spread outside of Great Bend. Most of my days were spent moving hay, mending fences, or hauling equipment between fields. The man I worked for, old-timer named Harris, owned a few hundred acres of mixed pasture and corn, and he still believed in doing things the old way. No big crews, just one or two of us working long hours until things got done. That afternoon was bright and windless, the air thick and heavy, the kind of day when every sound carries. You could hear the cicadas buzzing in the cottonwoods, and when you shut off the tractor, it was so quiet it almost felt like you'd gone deaf. We'd been baling hay all morning, big round bales for the cattle. Harris had gone off to check a gate on the south end of the property, leaving me to finish a few rows before sunset. The baler was an older model, one of those heavy red New Holland machines that could compress a ton of hay into a single roll the size of a small car. It hooked to the tractor with a PTO shaft, and when that thing was running, the belts inside turned like a living thing, spinning, pressing, wrapping, cutting. You could feel the vibration through the seat when you sat on the tractor. Every farmer knows how dangerous those things are. You're always told, kill the PTO before you go near it. It's drilled into your head from day one, but sometimes when you're tired or rushing, you think you can just reach in and pull a jam loose. That day, I remember the last bale I finished before it happened. The sun was low, just over the horizon, and the sky had turned that deep orange color that comes right before dusk. Dust hung in the air from the tractor tires, glowing in the light. The field stretched out empty in every direction. Flat land, no houses, no roads, just a line of cottonwoods in the distance. I'd been running the baler for hours, sweat drying to salt on my arms, my shirt sticking to my back. I remember thinking I'd stop soon, maybe head back for supper. The last windrow of hay was thin, patchy. As I fed it in, the baler started to groan, that low mechanical strain that means something's not feeding right. I eased the tractor forward a few feet, then stopped. The belts thumped once, then jammed. I shut down the throttle, but not the PTO. I thought it'd just be a small clump stuck near the pickup. I could clear it quick and be done. When I stepped off the tractor, the ground crunched under my boots. The engine hummed steady behind me, the smell of diesel mixing with dry hay. The baler clicked every few seconds like it was straining against itself. I walked around to the side, watching the belts turn just barely, enough to see them move slow and stubborn. The jam was near the intake. A wad of hay had tangled with one of the metal teeth. I remember hesitating there, standing with one glove already off, feeling the heat from the metal. I could hear the faint squeak of the belts and the rhythmic hiss of the hydraulic pump. I should have shut it off completely. Every part of me knew that. But when you're young, you think you can outsmart the machine. I'd done it before, just a quick pull, nothing to it. I slid my right hand in, glove on, trying to tug the hay free. It didn't move. I gave it another pull. Then I felt the faintest jerk, like something catching the fabric of my glove. Before I could even register what had happened, my hand was gone, yanked forward, swallowed into the gap. The next few seconds didn't even feel real. The machine caught the glove, then the sleeve, then my arm, pulling with a force that didn't make sense. I tried to twist away, but the power of the PTO is beyond human strength. It's pure torque, constant and merciless. I remember the shock of pain, white hot, not sharp, but deep, spreading up through my shoulder. The sound of my own voice yelling, though it didn't sound like me. My body jerked forward, my boots slipping in the dirt. I must have hit the ground hard because the next thing I remember is staring up at the open Kansas sky, the edges of my vision pulsing dark. The machine was still running, still moving in slow rhythm. My arm was twisted in the belts and I could feel the pressure. No pain now, just pressure, like my arm was part of the machine itself. I tried to move, tried to reach for the tractor controls, but I couldn't get any leverage. The smell of burnt rubber and hay filled the air. My mouth was dry, my throat raw. At some point, the world started fading. The engine sound grew distant. The light dimmed. And I remember thinking how stupid it was, that one small mistake, 1 second of impatience. I thought about my boots, about how the ground felt under them, how I'd walked around that baler twice before doing it, circling it like I was waiting for permission. I'd left my footprints all around it, like a record of my hesitation. Then everything went quiet. When they found me the next morning, the sun was already high. Harris had come out early, wondering why I hadn't returned the night before. The tractor was still idling low, the baler half-rotated in its cycle. The hay I'd been feeding had turned brown overnight, scattered in a loose pile. My body was still tangled in the machinery, the belts holding me in place. They said it looked peaceful in a strange way, like I'd fallen asleep standing. The sheriff said I'd probably died just after sunset, from blood loss or shock. They told me later that the footprints were still visible in the dirt all around the baler, my boot prints circling it again and again, like I'd known deep down that something wasn't right. Maybe I'd walked around it trying to convince myself to shut it off. Maybe I'd paused to think how long it would take to fix. Maybe I just didn't want to climb back into the tractor again. Afterward, Harris couldn't bring himself to use that baler again. He kept it in the shed behind the barn, covered with a tarp, even though the sheriff had said it wasn't damaged. He told the other hands not to go near it, not because he believed in ghosts or curses, but because he didn't want to hear that sound again. The slow creak of the mechanism when they found me. It was a sound he said he'd never forget, the kind that sticks in your head like a hum. Years later, when I think about that day, it's not the pain I remember most. It's the quiet, the long, empty silence of that Kansas field, the stillness of the air, the weight of standing there with the sun dropping low, knowing what I should do but doing the wrong thing anyway. Machines don't forgive mistakes. They don't stop because you panic or scream. They just keep doing what they were built to do. That's what the sheriff said too. He told Harris that night at the scene. It was just bad timing, nothing more. The boy reached in when he shouldn't have. The PTO kept turning. The machine did its job. Nothing haunted about it, nothing mysterious. Just a few bad seconds and a life gone. But sometimes, when the fields are quiet and the wind dies down, you can still hear things out there. The distant thump of a baler's belts turning, the creak of metal under strain. It's not supernatural. It's memory. The land remembers what happens on it. And in that patch of dirt, under the same Kansas sky, the marks of my boots stayed visible for weeks until the rain came and washed them away. I worked for the county for a few years, doing inspection work on rural properties in northern Oregon. Most of the time, it was nothing unusual. Checking fence lines, making sure livestock were kept properly, water rights, that kind of thing. In 1997, I got called out to a small sheep farm outside of Vernonia. The caretaker there was an older man named Walter, lived alone. He'd been looking after the property for a rancher who lived down in Salem. The neighbors hadn't seen him for several days, and they called it in because the sheep hadn't been moved from one pasture to another, which Walter usually did every 2 days or so. The place was about 7 miles from the nearest paved road, down a narrow track that cut through thick stands of fir and alder. The grass along the edges was overgrown, brushing both sides of my truck. It was late spring, cool air with that damp smell of earth and pine needles. When I pulled up, the gate was open. The latch had been hooked around the post but not locked. The gravel drive curved up toward a small farmhouse, maybe 40 years old. White paint faded and peeling. His truck was parked beside it. An old Ford with a flatbed, still covered in mud like it had been used just a few days earlier. The first thing that stood out was how quiet it was. Usually on a farm, you hear movement, the bleating of sheep, dogs barking, something. But the only sound was the wind in the trees. The sheep were all crowded into the far end of their pen, standing close together. The grass in there was chewed down to dirt. I remember thinking they should have been moved days ago. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw the door slightly open. A radio inside was playing low, one of those AM stations that fade in and out between songs. On a small table by the door sat a coffee mug, half full, cold. A pack of cigarettes next to it. Everything looked like someone had just stepped out for a minute. Inside, the house smelled stale, like damp wool and burnt coffee. The kitchen light was still on. A plate sat in the sink with dried egg on it. His boots were missing from beside the door, which meant he'd gone out wearing them. I checked the small bedroom. Bed unmade, clothes still on the chair, wallet and keys sitting on the dresser. Nothing that looked like he'd packed or planned to go anywhere. Behind the house, there was a narrow path that led downhill toward a small creek. The grass there was trampled, like he or the sheepdog had gone back and forth. The pen gate was wide open, one side hanging crooked where the hinge pin had come loose. There were prints in the dirt, but the ground was dry enough that they were just faint impressions. Looked like one-person boots, maybe heading toward the trees. I followed the path. The creek was about half a mile down, more of a trickle than a stream, running over rocks and moss. The banks were soft in spots but not deep. No real sign of a fall or anything washed out, just leaves, mud, and still water. Then near a bend in the creek, I saw something half buried in the grass. A boot, old leather brown. Looked like the same kind Walter wore. One of the laces was broken. There was no blood, no torn ground, no drag marks. Just that one boot lying there, like it had been placed instead of lost. We searched the area for days after that. Deputies came out with dogs, volunteers, even a couple of guys from the Forest Service who knew the area well. We covered the fields, the woods, the creek, and the old logging trails that ran out toward the hills. Nothing. Not a shred of clothing, not a footprint, not a scent. It was like he'd vanished in broad daylight. The more time I spent there, the stranger it felt. Not in any supernatural way, but in how still everything was. The sheep barely moved, like they were waiting for something. The dog that lived on the farm, an old border collie, was found tied up in the barn. Low on food, but alive. It barked constantly when anyone went near the creek. The sheriff's office figured maybe Walter had gone down to clear a branch or something from the water and slipped. But the thing was, there hadn't been any rain that week, and the creek wasn't anywhere near deep enough to pull someone under. A few of us who knew the area talked about other possibilities. Maybe he'd gone into the woods and gotten lost, had a heart attack or fallen into a ravine. But the terrain wasn't rough enough for that. And if he'd wandered off, the dogs would have caught the scent. They didn't. The official report said, missing, presumed drowned, even though there was no evidence of drowning. It was easier that way. The property owner put up a small wooden cross near the creek later that summer. I went back a couple times after that just to check on the livestock, until they found someone new to manage it. The new caretaker was a younger guy from Tillamook. He didn't like the place much, said it felt off. He lasted less than a year before quitting. Years later, I still thought about that farm. I'd driven by it a few times on inspection work. The pasture fences were replaced, a new barn built, but the same creek still ran through the back field. I stopped once, stood there for a while, just listening. The same stillness hung in the air, like the place hadn't moved on. When I retired, I went through old case notes and found the report from that week. Something I hadn't noticed before caught my eye. One of the deputies had written about the boot found near the creek. He'd measured it and compared it to the pair left inside the house. The size didn't match exactly, half a size smaller. I double-checked the photo in the file, and sure enough, the boot looked older, worn differently, with a faint discoloration near the toe like it had been in the dirt a long time. It made me wonder if that boot had even been his. That creek ran through a lot of properties before it reached the river, cutting through old farmland, some of it abandoned. There'd been another caretaker out there years earlier, back in the 70s, who disappeared under similar circumstances. No body, no clear reason. I don't think anyone ever connected it because the records were old, and most people didn't care to dig into it. But that little detail, the wrong boot, the open gate, the sheep staying bunched together, stuck with me. The simplest explanation was that he left on foot. Got lost, maybe collapsed somewhere no one thought to look. That's what everyone said. But every time I think about it, I picture that cold cup of coffee on the porch, the radio still playing, and the open gate swaying in the wind. Someone walked out of that house through the field, down toward the water, and never came back. Sometimes when you work around isolated places long enough, you start to notice how fast nature takes things back. A place can go from lived in to forgotten in a matter of weeks. The sheep get moved, the fences rot, the grass grows over the path. But there's something different about when a person disappears from it. It leaves a kind of pause in the land, like the air remembers. I don't think Walter drowned. I don't think he ran off either. I think he went down that path to check on something. Maybe heard a noise, maybe followed a trail in the brush. And whatever he found, or whoever he found, didn't leave much behind. The open gate, the quiet sheep, and that one boot were all that remained. When I drove away that last day, the sun was low and orange, cutting through the trees. I looked in the mirror and saw the farm getting smaller behind me, the gate swinging a little in the wind. I haven't been back since. Every few years, I still hear people mention the story. The caretaker who vanished without a trace. They always end it the same way, saying maybe he fell in the creek. But anyone who's ever stood there knows better. The water's not deep enough for that, and it never was. I bought the place in late 2015. A small white farmhouse on 15 acres just outside of Brattleboro, Vermont. It had a red barn, a chicken coop, and a long dirt driveway that cut through maple trees before opening to a small clearing. It looked quiet, peaceful, and exactly what I wanted when I left Boston to start something new. I'd been working as a graphic designer, mostly from home, and thought a farm stay would be a good side business. Simple rooms, home-cooked breakfasts, a few animals for guests to feed. It wasn't meant to be a real farm, just a place people could come to get away from the city. By spring of 2016, things were going well. I had bookings every weekend, and I spent most of my time tending to small chores, collecting eggs, mowing the fields, and cleaning rooms. The first thing I noticed was small, stupid stuff. Can of soup missing from the pantry, a bag of crackers opened when I didn't remember eating any, apples gone from the basket. I thought I was just being forgetful. I had guests coming in and out every few days, and sometimes they used the kitchen even though they weren't supposed to. It didn't bother me much at first. By early June, it started feeling strange. I would find the kitchen window slightly open when I was sure I had closed it. A spoon left out, a chair pulled back. Tiny things, easy to overlook, but enough to leave a small ache of unease. I told myself it was just the guests being careless, maybe helping themselves late at night. Still, I started double-checking locks before bed. The barn door was one of those sliding wooden kinds, heavy but easy to wedge open. I made a habit of checking it every night, too. There was something about the barn that always felt off after dark. During the day, it was bright and harmless. Dust hanging in the light, the smell of hay and wood. But at night, it seemed alive in a different way. Sound carried strangely inside it. Every creak and shift of the boards sounded like movement. I told myself it was animals. I'd seen raccoons near the feed sacks before, and sometimes owls nested up in the rafters. Around mid-July, I had a family staying in the main guest room, 2 parents and a little boy. The morning after their first night, the mother mentioned that she'd heard footsteps outside around 3 in the morning. I brushed it off, told her it was probably deer. The woods were full of them, but that day, when I went to get eggs, I noticed that the small back door to the barn, the one I almost never used, had been unlatched. It didn't swing open easily. Someone had to lift and pull to move it. I stood there for a while, staring into the darkness inside. Listening for anything, nothing, just that dry, hollow silence barns have when they're still. A week later, I decided to check my security camera footage. I had an old setup, a single camera pointing at the driveway and another one on the side of the house that caught the edge of the barn. It was mostly for insurance in case someone's car got broken into. I hadn't looked at the recordings in months. That night, around midnight, I sat in bed scrolling through hours of footage on my laptop. The first thing I noticed was the motion alerts. The system had flagged movement behind the barn several nights in a row. I opened one clip from around 2:30 a.m. It was grainy black and white video. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the side of the barn and some wind moving through the trees. Then from the corner of the frame, a faint shape appeared. A man barefoot walking slowly along the fence line. He stopped near the barn door, turned his head as if listening, then disappeared out of frame. My stomach dropped. I went back through the footage. Same thing again and again every few nights. Always late, always quiet, always near the barn. Sometimes he came from the woods, sometimes from the backfield. In one clip, he seemed to climb up the side of the barn using the old wooden slats as a ladder. I couldn't tell what he was doing once he got up there. The camera couldn't see that far. The next morning, I waited until the guests checked out, then went to the barn with a flashlight. I climbed the ladder to the loft. It was mostly storage. Old furniture, boxes of decorations, spare feed. The air was thick with dust and the smell was sharp like stale hay and sweat. I almost didn't see it at first, hidden behind a stack of wooden crates. A sleeping bag, flattened from use. A pile of clothes, a plastic bag filled with empty cans, and one of my kitchen towels. Next to it, a small candle stuck in a glass jar. For a long time, I just stood there, feeling my skin go cold. It was clear someone had been living up there, maybe for weeks. The sleeping bag looked used but not old, and the candle was burned halfway down. I didn't touch anything. I climbed down, went back to the house, and locked every door. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me sit up. The way the wind hit the siding, the faint rustle of branches, it all felt deliberate, like someone was out there moving just slow enough not to be heard clearly. I kept thinking about the missing food, the open window, the motion alerts. He'd probably been there the whole time, slipping in and out whenever I wasn't around. Watching. The next morning, I called the police. They came out later that afternoon. A small crew of local officers in tan uniforms. They showed them the footage and the sleeping area. They didn't say much, just nodded and took some pictures. One of them said it looked like a drifter. Maybe someone who'd wandered off the highway a few miles away. They thought he might have been living there for weeks, possibly longer. They searched the property but didn't find him. They said they'd keep an eye out, and that I should keep my doors locked. That was all. For a few days, I felt a kind of hollow relief, like something heavy had been lifted. But that feeling didn't last. Even after they cleaned out the loft and took the sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the sense that someone was still watching. Every night I'd turn on the floodlight outside, and every night I'd catch myself looking toward the barn windows, half expecting to see a face. A week later, I found footprints behind the chicken coop. Bare feet pressed deep into the damp soil. They led from the edge of the woods toward the barn and stopped near the wall where the man used to climb up. The police came back, took a look, and said they were probably old. But I knew they weren't. The rain had just come through the night before. I stopped renting the place out by the end of that summer. I told people I needed to take a break, but the truth was I couldn't relax there anymore. The house felt wrong after dark. Every time the wind pushed against the siding, it felt like someone brushing past. The floors creaked louder than before, and sometimes I'd wake up certain I'd heard footsteps on the porch. I tried to stay. I lasted until October, but by then I couldn't handle it. Even though I never saw him again, I knew he'd been there longer than anyone had realized. The police told me later they thought he might have been living in the woods nearby for months before he started using the barn, maybe watching the property. Learning when I was gone, when guests were there, how to move around unnoticed. The thing that gets to me most is that I always felt like someone was watching me on that property, even before I knew. It wasn't paranoia. It was something quiet and steady, like a weight on my back whenever I went outside after sunset. The camera footage just proved what I'd already felt deep down. I sold the place that winter. The woman who bought it said she loved how peaceful it felt. I told her it was during the day. I didn't tell her about the man in the barn. I figured there was no point. Maybe it was over. Maybe he moved on. But sometimes when I think about that loft, the way it smelled, the way it felt standing up there knowing someone had been sleeping only a few feet above where I'd walked every morning, it still makes my stomach turn. I still wonder how many nights he was awake while I slept in that house. How many times he watched me through the kitchen window while I cooked, or stood just outside the barn door waiting for me to leave. I'll never really know. But I know this. Some places feel peaceful because they're quiet, and some feel peaceful because something out there is watching, waiting, keeping still enough to stay unseen. I still remember the smell of smoke that morning in 1989. It was one of those fall mornings that start cool and quiet, when the air feels damp and the light hangs low over the fields. My father, Henry, had been up before sunrise. He always said it was better to get the burning done early, before the wind started to pick up. Every year after harvest, he burned off the leftover stubble to clear the field for spring. It was routine for him. He'd done it for decades. But that morning, everything felt a little different. The sky had a gray tint and the wind was just barely moving through the wheat stubble when he lit the first edge. I was inside the house, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching from the window. I could see him walking along the field's edge, that slow, steady gait he always had, the matchstick in his hand leaving thin trails of orange flame behind him. It looked harmless at first, controlled, slow-moving, the kind of fire that burned steady and predictable. I went outside after a few minutes, leaning against the fence, just watching. The smell of burning straw mixed with the sharp scent of earth. I remember thinking how normal it all looked, how it was just another morning on the farm. The smoke began to rise in thin columns straight up into the calm air. But then without warning, the breeze shifted. I felt it against my face, just a little stronger, coming from the west. The fire began to lean in that direction, licking faster across the rows of stubble. My father noticed it too. I saw him stop, turn toward the barn, and then start jogging to the tractor. It was the kind of wind that builds in seconds, the kind that doesn't give you time to think. The line of fire that had been moving slowly suddenly doubled back, catching on dry patches. Flames began racing across the field, their edges curling and snapping. I could see the smoke thickening, turning from light gray to a darker brown. My father climbed onto the tractor, his hat flying off behind him, and started the engine. I could hear the low rumble even from where I stood. He drove straight toward the middle of the field, trying to cut a line through the wheat stubble to stop the fire from spreading. That was what he always did when things got out of hand. He'd use the tractor to plow a fire break, a strip of bare soil to stop the flames. For a moment, it looked like he might manage it. The tractor cut a sharp path, the plow behind it turning up soil. But the fire was moving faster than I had ever seen. The wind had picked up to a full gust, carrying sparks across the dry rows. Every spark that landed started a new flame. Within seconds, the fire had jumped the furrows he'd just made. It was no longer just burning the stubble. It was eating everything in its path. The heat reached me even from the fence line. The air shimmered and the smell turned bitter. I could hear the crackle of burning straw over the wind, like 1,000 sheets of paper tearing at once. I ran back toward the house to grab the phone, my hands shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I dialed 911 and told them there was a field fire, that my father was out there. The woman on the line told me to stay calm and keep back from the flames. I said yes, but I wasn't calm. I could barely think. When I ran back outside, the field was an orange haze. The smoke had rolled in so thick I couldn't see more than a few yards ahead. The tractor was still moving, but slower now. I could just make out its shape through the smoke, a dark outline with flashes of metal catching the light. My father was still inside, hunched forward, gripping the wheel. He was trying to swing around to get to the lower edge of the fire. I knew what he was thinking. He didn't want it to spread to the neighbor's property. Their land bordered ours just beyond the slope, and if the fire reached there, it would be twice as bad. That was the kind of man he was. He wouldn't quit, even when things got dangerous, but the smoke was too heavy. The wind was blowing it straight into his path. I watched as the tractor slowed almost to a stop. I wanted to run out there, to do something, but the heat was like a wall. My eyes burned, and every breath felt like it was coated in ash. The flames were spreading in every direction now. I could hear the roar of it, a low, constant sound, like a freight train far off but getting closer. I kept yelling his name even though I knew he couldn't hear me. The fire crews came within 15 minutes, but by then, the entire field was gone. Flames had already reached the fence line, black smoke rolling across the sky. The firefighters worked from the road, laying out hoses and cutting new lines with their equipment. They moved with that kind of practiced urgency that comes from knowing what fire can do. They told me to stay back, but I couldn't stop watching. I was waiting for some sign of him, for the tractor to move again, for him to walk out through the smoke. But it never happened. When they finally reached the tractor, it was barely recognizable. The paint had blistered and peeled away. The glass was gone. The metal parts had warped and sagged under the heat. Inside, what was left of my father was still sitting upright, his hands locked around the wheel. The fire had burned hot enough to melt steel, and yet he was still in the same position he'd been in when I last saw him. The fire chief said it must have happened fast, that the smoke probably got him before the flames did. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, staring at what was left of the man who'd taught me everything about that land. The field smoldered for 2 more days. Every time the wind picked up, little pockets of fire would flare again in the blackened rows. I stayed there the whole time, helping the crews until it was finally safe to walk across the soil. The ground was still warm under my boots. The tractor was just a twisted frame sitting in the middle of it all. I found the remains of his hat half buried in the ash, the brim burnt through but still holding its shape. I took it home and set it on the kitchen table. It stayed there for a long time. After the fire, word spread fast. The neighbors came by in silence, bringing food, offering help, saying things they thought might make it easier, but nothing really did. For weeks after, whenever I looked out across the fields, I saw that black scar cutting across the land. Every night I'd see the glow of embers in my mind, that orange reflection against the smoke. I'd think about how quick it all happened, how just one shift in the wind was enough to change everything. I rebuilt most of the farm the following year. The field grew back green again, but I never burned it after harvest again. I left the stubble to rot back into the soil. I couldn't light another fire, not after that. Every time I smelled smoke, my stomach turned. Even on calm days when a neighbor burned their fields miles away, the sight of that rising column made me stop whatever I was doing. It always took me back to that morning. People still talk about it around here. Every fall, when the harvest ends and someone lights their field, someone always brings up that day. They say things like, "Remember that fire near the Dawson place," or "Keep an eye on the wind." They mean my father. They mean the man who stayed too long trying to protect what he'd built. Sometimes I drive past that same field, and even though it's been decades, I can still see the faint outline of where the tractor sat. The soil there looks a little darker, a little heavier. It's the kind of mark that doesn't fade. That day taught me more than any season before it. It showed me how fast everything can go wrong, how the same land that feeds you can also take everything away. It wasn't a lesson anyone wants, but it's one that stays with you. Every time I see smoke on the horizon now, I think about how he must have felt in those last moments, still trying to do the right thing, still gripping that wheel, even as the world around him burned.